There is a specific image that people tend to remember when they think about The Walking Dead at its best. Not a monster, not a battle, not the particular kind of violence that the show became famous for across its 11-season run. Not the gore or the grief or the moments of shock that the series deployed so reliably that they became almost expected after a while. No, the image that people returned to, the one that critics kept citing years later when they tried to explain what had made the show genuinely extraordinary, was something much quieter than any of that. It was a man on a horse, riding alone down the middle of an empty interstate in Atlanta, Georgia, a city that was once one of the most populated in the American South, a city of highways and traffic and the constant, exhausting noise of several million people living in close proximity to each other. Now completely, utterly silent. No cars moving, no people walking, no sounds at all except the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves against the cracked asphalt and the dry wind moving through the abandoned vehicles on either side of the road. And the man sitting on that horse, riding into a silence where a city used to be, looking at what was left with an expression that contained simultaneously the grief of someone who had already understood and the determination of someone who had decided that understanding was not enough reason to stop. That image aired on October 31st, 2010, Halloween night, and for the people who watched it that evening, it landed the way that only the very best television ever lands. Like something that was always supposed to exist had finally arrived. Like a story that had been waiting in the space between the things people usually told each other had finally found the shape it needed. The Walking Dead went on to become the biggest show on cable television in the history of American broadcasting. 17 million people watched its season 5 premiere. For 75 consecutive episodes, it drew more than 10 million viewers every single week. It became a franchise worth billions of dollars, spinning off merchandise and theme park attractions and video games, and an entire expanding universe of new shows that continued adding chapters to the story long after the original had reached its conclusion. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, something was lost. Not slowly, exactly. Not all at once either, but in a series of very specific moments, each one connected to the last by a logic that becomes clear only when you look at the full distance travelled. Each one driven by the same underlying force, the force that the show itself, at its absolute best, understood more clearly than almost anything else on television at the time. The force that takes people and changes them in ways they did not choose and did not always recognise until it was already done. The force of survival, and the very particular kind of damage that success, when it arrives in large enough quantities, tends to inflict on the thing that earned it. This is the story of how The Walking Dead's golden age was built, and how the machine that grew up around it, quietly and without any single catastrophic decision, dismantled it from the inside. But to understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was there. And for that, you have to go back further than most people think. Further back than the show itself even. Back to the years when the story barely existed, when the person who wanted to tell it was being told repeatedly, and by people who should have known better, that nobody would want to hear it. Frank Darabont spent 4 years trying to get The Walking Dead made before AMC finally said yes. 4 years of meetings and phone calls and pitches and the particular kind of frustration that comes from knowing that something is good and being unable to convince the people with the power to make it happen of that fact. He had come to the project after reading Robert Kirkman's comic book series, which had begun publication in 2003 and had built a devoted readership on the premise that the real horror in a world overrun by the undead was not the undead themselves. It was what happened to the living, the compromises they made, the things they became, the particular grief of surviving in a world where survival came at a cost that kept rising. Darabont recognised in Kirkman's story something that he believed could work as television in a way that very few genre projects had managed to achieve. Not genre television in the way that Word usually operated in the industry as a slightly apologetic label for entertaining but ultimately disposable content. Prestige genre television. The kind of thing that the best of cable was beginning to prove was possible. He took the project to NBC first. NBC was interested. NBC was enthusiastic even, right up until the moment when he handed them a script in which the undead were actually behaving as the story required them to behave. At which point NBC passed. As Darabont explained years later, they'd been very excited about the idea of doing a zombie show right up until he handed them a zombie script where the zombies were actually doing zombie things. The concept sat. Darabont kept trying. He brought the project to AMC in a different moment, a moment when the network had just finished its second season of Mad Men and was in the middle of proving something important about what basic cable could be. AMC in 2010 was in the business of demonstrating that prestige television was not exclusive to HBO. Breaking Bad was building the kind of audience that talked about it the way people talked about the best of literature. The network was looking for something that would extend that identity into genre storytelling. Darabont offered them a zombie story about the end of the world and what it revealed about human nature. They said yes. What followed was 6 episodes of television that critics and fans still discuss, more than 15 years later, as some of the finest drama the medium has ever produced. The pilot episode, titled Days Gone By, premiered on the 31st of October 2010. Halloween night, a choice that was either brilliantly appropriate or simply fortunate, depending on who you ask. It received 5.35 million viewers on that first broadcast, making it the most watched series premiere in AMC's history at that time. But the raw number understates what happened that night, and what kept happening over the 6 episodes of Season 1. What the show delivered in that first 67 minutes was something that felt categorically different from what people expected when they sat down to watch a zombie program. It looked different to begin with. Darabont had shot the pilot on 16mm film, a choice that gave the images a texture and weight that was closer to the best American cinema of the 1970s than it was to anything else currently airing on Sunday evenings. The show looked like a feature film. It moved like a feature film. It was willing to spend time on things that had no action in them whatsoever, on the silence of an abandoned hospital corridor, or on the expression of a man who was figuring out what he had missed while he was unconscious and the world was ending without him. Darabont had split his original pilot script in 2 specifically, in his own words, to slow the narrative down and dig into the characters more deeply, so that the story was not just plot-driven, event-driven material. He wanted the audience to be living with these people before anything happened to them. He wanted the horror, when it arrived, to land on a foundation of human feeling rather than simply on the viewer's general awareness that this was a horror show and horror things would eventually occur. At the centre of it was Rick Grimes, played by Andrew Lincoln, a classically trained British actor who buried his accent so completely that American viewers took his Georgia drawl entirely at face value. Rick was not the typical protagonist of this kind of story. He was not reckless or invulnerable or defined by the particular brand of cool competence that most action heroes carried as their primary characteristic. He was a man who woke up alone in a hospital room, walked out into a world that had ended while he was unconscious, and then spent the rest of the episode trying to understand what had happened with a kind of quiet, devastated determination that was almost unbearable to watch because it felt so completely and utterly true. The choice to make Rick a survivor returning to a disaster rather than a person experiencing the disaster in real time was the smartest single decision Darabont made in adapting Kirkman's material. It turned the audience's natural disorientation into an emotional experience rather than a narrative one. We did not simply learn about this world, we discovered it at exactly the same pace that Rick did, through the same mixture of horror and grief and the particular kind of desperate hope that comes from not yet fully believing what your eyes are telling you. The show in those early seasons was not, at its heart, about monsters. The monsters were present. They were genuinely frightening, realised through practical effects work by Greg Nicotero's team that set a standard for the genre that has rarely been matched since, but they were not the point. The point was the people trying to survive them. And more specifically, the point was what surviving them asked of those people, and whether the price was one that could be paid without losing everything that made survival worth having in the first place. This is what separated The Walking Dead from almost everything else in its genre. Most zombie stories, whether in film or literature or earlier television, treated the undead as the primary threat and structured their narratives around the problem of physical survival. The Walking Dead treated the undead as a kind of extreme weather condition, devastating and constant and requiring constant adaptation, but fundamentally less interesting than the human drama that occurred among the people coping with it. The threat in The Walking Dead was not the walkers. The threat was what the walkers forced people to become. Rick Grimes was interesting not because he was good at surviving, but because of how he thought about survival. He believed, in a way that the show spent years testing and complicating and almost breaking entirely, that the goal of surviving the end of the world was not simply to remain alive, it was to remain the kind of person who was worth keeping alive. To protect not just his physical existence, but the moral architecture that gave that existence meaning. He wanted to build something, not just a safe place with walls and weapons, but a community with values. A small version of the civilization that had been lost, rebuilt from the people who had made it through the worst. That belief, and the way the show interrogated it through everything that happened to Rick and the people around him, was the emotional engine of the Golden Age. It was not a simple belief. The show did not treat it as one. Every season presented new evidence that the belief was naive, or insufficient, or coming at a cost that Rick did not always fully account for. But it was never abandoned, not in the first 5 seasons, not in the years when the show was operating at its highest level. The engine kept running, the moral question stayed open, and the audience kept watching because they genuinely did not know how it would resolve, and because they cared with a depth that surprised many of them about the answer. The specific episodes that define the Golden Age are not the ones with the most action or the largest body counts. They are the ones that made the audience feel something that lingered after the credits rolled. There was Vartos, the 4th episode of the first season, in which what appeared to be a brutal confrontation with a hostile gang resolved into the revelation that the gang was protecting an abandoned nursing home full of elderly residents who had nowhere else to go. It was a small episode by the standards of what the show would become. No major character deaths, no catastrophic events, just a story about the way the apocalypse looked different depending on where you were standing when it arrived. But it contained something that the best episodes of The Walking Dead always contained. A moment of genuine humanity that the situation had no reason to produce, but that the characters produced anyway, out of something that felt less like strategy and more like instinct. There was Pretty Much Dead already, the mid-season finale of Season 2, which arrived after 7 episodes of what many viewers found frustratingly slow and farm-bound storytelling, and delivered one of the most devastating single moments in the show's entire run. The revelation that Sophia, the child everyone had been searching for since the 2nd episode of the season, had been in the barn full of walkers the entire time, dead and reanimated, waiting inside the thing that had been the centre of the search without anyone knowing. The shot of the barn doors opening, of the walkers stumbling out, of Rick finally stepping forward to do what had to be done after the silence that contained everything the scene needed to contain. It remains, for many people, the single most powerful moment in 11 seasons of television. There was The Grove, a Season 4 episode that functioned less like a television drama and more like a short story in the tradition of the best American literature of grief and moral consequence. Carol and Tyrese, along with Mika and Lizzie and Judith, sheltered in a house surrounded by a ruined world. And the decision that Carol had to make at the end of that episode, standing in a field with a wildflower grove at its edge, doing the thing that was necessary because nobody else would or could. The episode earned comparisons to Flannery O'Connor, to Cormac McCarthy, to the bleakest and most honest traditions of American storytelling about what people are capable of when the structures that usually regulate those capabilities are gone. It remains, for many critics and long-time viewers, the finest single hour the show ever produced. These episodes shared a quality that is easy to describe and extraordinarily difficult to sustain across a long production. They trusted their characters. They were not trying to shock the audience into staying or manipulate them into feeling things on a schedule. In fact, they were trying to make the audience feel something real, and they did it by treating the feeling as the point rather than as a side effect of something more structurally exciting happening elsewhere in the story. That quality, that specific artistic seriousness in the approach to human drama came from a particular creative vision, and that vision was about to be removed from the show before most of its eventual audience had even started watching. The conditions that produced the Golden Age were built on something that the commercial success of the show would eventually make impossible to preserve. They were built on the specific hunger of people who did not yet know how large this would become, who were making something they believed in for reasons that had nothing to do with merchandise revenue, or franchise development, or the quarterly earnings of a cable network. They were built on the particular kind of care that only flourishes when the people exercising it have no certainty that anyone is paying attention and are making the thing anyway because the thing matters to them. That kind of care does not survive success unchanged. It cannot. Success brings attention, and attention brings pressure, and pressure brings a different set of calculations into the room where creative decisions get made. Not all at once, not in any single decisive moment, but steadily, accumulation by accumulation, decision by decision, compromise by compromise, until what remains is something that uses the same words and the same images and the same characters, but is being made from a fundamentally different place. The story of how that happened to The Walking Dead begins with the firing of the man who built it. There is a moment in the life of almost every creative project that succeeds beyond the expectations of the people who made it, when the project stops belonging to them in any meaningful sense and begins belonging to the institution that has grown up around it. It is rarely a single dramatic rupture. It tends to arrive through a series of smaller events that each seem reasonable in isolation and only reveal their collective meaning when viewed from a distance. For The Walking Dead, there was a specific date that functions as the clearest marker of where the show's first chapter ended. That date was somewhere in July of 2011. More precisely, it was in the days immediately following July 22nd, the day Frank Darabont had appeared on a Comic-Con panel to promote the second season of the show he had built from the ground up. He'd been on stage in San Diego in front of thousands of people who loved what he had made, talking about what was coming. He did not know, standing there, that he was 3 days away from being fired. Neither did the cast, neither did the crew. When the news came, it came through the particular, cold bureaucratic channel that all such news travels in the television industry. The cast was summoned to a lunch meeting with an AMC programming vice president who told them that Darabont was out. The crew was briefed separately, and those gathered were stunned by what one insider described as the duplicity of the network, having used Darabont to promote the show in San Diego before dismissing him 3 days later. They were angry at the absence of any real explanation. They were told, in the flat and final language that networks use when they have made a decision and have no interest in defending it, that things simply were not working. One member of the production described the situation in terms that captured its stakes precisely. They were on a zombie show, she noted. That meant the people in question were all, professionally speaking, very easy to kill off. Nobody with a role on the series was going to speak publicly against the network's decision, not if they wanted to keep their role. The story that AMC initially offered to the press was that Darabont had struggled to adjust to the pace of television production. He was a feature film director. He thought in months rather than weeks. He wanted to take the time a scene required rather than the time the production schedule allowed. This framing was not entirely without basis. Darabont did bring a filmmaker's approach to the work, one that was demanding and sometimes difficult to accommodate within the operational reality of a network television production. But the actual reason, as court documents and reporting would later confirm in considerable detail, was considerably more straightforward. AMC wanted to cut the show's budget, and they wanted to do it in the same moment that they were doubling the episode order. The first season of The Walking Dead had consisted of 6 episodes. AMC ordered 16 episodes for the second season. They also, at the same time, cut the show's overall budget by approximately 20%. For Darabont, who had spent 4 years fighting to get this story made and who had consistently advocated for the kind of production resources that would allow the show to maintain the cinematic quality of its first season, this was an impossible equation. You could not make more of the thing that had made the show special for less money than had originally been spent making it. The math did not work. More episodes, less money, less time, and a network that wanted the show to adapt its ambitions accordingly. Darabont had pushed back. He had argued that the show's success was directly connected to the level of care that had gone into producing it, and that reducing the budget while increasing the episode order would inevitably compromise the product. The argument was not wrong. It was also not one that AMC had any particular interest in hearing, given that the financial logic of doubling the episode count while cutting per episode costs was clear enough, and the show's ratings were strong enough to suggest that the audience would follow regardless of any subtle reduction in quality. So Darabont was removed. Glenn Mazzara, who had been an executive producer on the series and who was, by all accounts, a skilled and professional television showrunner, took over his responsibilities for seasons 2 and 3. The immediate creative consequence of this change was visible in season 2 in ways that are difficult to fully separate from the budgetary constraints that accompanied it. Most of season 2 takes place on Herschel Green's farm. This was not a narrative choice made because the story required it. It was a practical choice made because the farm was a single, controllable, already built location that could accommodate 16 episodes of production without the expense of constructing new sets or filming in multiple locations. The roaming, expansive quality of season 1, the show that moved through Atlanta and its outskirts with the freedom of something that was genuinely exploring a world, contracted sharply into something much more contained. Many viewers found season 2 slow. The criticism, which was substantial and vocal, focused on the pace of the storytelling and the sense that characters were having the same conversations about survival and morality and what to do next repeatedly, in different configurations, without the story advancing at a rate that felt commensurate with the narrative urgency the show had established in its first 6 episodes. The farm, it was said, went on too long. The arguments went in circles. The walkers were too absent. The horror had receded behind the drama in a way that felt like a miscalculation. In retrospect, what season 2 was actually doing was more complicated than that critique captured. The conversations on the farm were not simply filler or wheel spinning. They were the show attempting, with genuine seriousness, to work through the moral architecture of its characters. The extended stay at Herschel's property was an opportunity to examine what happens when survivors are forced to stop running and actually talk to each other about who they are and what they believe and what they are willing to do. Those were not trivial questions. The show asked them with real care. The problem was not the questions. The problem was the conditions under which they were being asked. Conditions that had been imposed from outside the creative process by decisions made at the network level before the season's creative team had any opportunity to respond to them. Glenn Mazzara stabilized the production. He was good at the job. The mid-season finale of Season 2, that barn sequence, that Sophia revelation, was one of the finest pieces of television the show ever produced, and it arrived under his watch. The Governor, the villain of Season 3, was one of the great antagonists of the era. Mazzara delivered. He kept the show viable and engaging during a period when a lesser talent in his position might have allowed it to fall apart entirely. But there is something specific that was present in Season 1 that Season 2 did not fully recover, and that no subsequent season fully recovered either. It was the sense that the show was being made by someone who understood exactly what it was about and would protect that understanding against any pressure to compromise it. Darabont had a specific idea of what this story was for. He had held that idea through 4 years of rejections and negotiations and the ordinary, grinding difficulty of getting anything made in the television industry. That kind of conviction, maintained through that kind of difficulty, it produces a creative centre of gravity that holds a production together in ways that are invisible until it is gone. Once Darabont was removed, the show became, in a structural sense, a collaboration between a network and a succession of showrunners who were doing excellent professional work within parameters they had inherited rather than built. The difference between working from the inside of a vision and working in service of one that preceded you is real and meaningful, and shows up in the work in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to feel. When Mazzara departed after Season 3, also under reported creative tensions with AMC, Scott Gimple took over. Gimple was, by many measures, the most successful of the show's 4 showrunners in pure commercial terms. Under his leadership, the show reached the peak of its ratings. Season 4 was critically praised as a return to the quality of the early seasons. Season 5's premiere drew 17.29 million viewers, the all-time record, on the 12th of October 2014. The machine was producing at the highest level it had ever produced. Gimple understood the source material. He was a genuine fan of Kirkman's comics and brought that knowledge to the work. He was capable of the kind of episode that went back to what the show did best: the quiet and devastating character study, the moral horror embedded in a domestic scene, the grief that arrived without warning and lingered. Under Gimple, The Walking Dead produced some of its finest hours of television. He also presided over the decisions that would permanently damage the show's relationship with its audience. And the most consequential of those decisions was not made by him alone. It was the product of the same commercial logic that had fired Darabont for wanting to maintain quality in the face of cost-cutting. It was the logic of a network that had watched its most valuable asset reach the summit of American cable television and was now faced with the question of how to keep it there. The answer that the network and its production team reached was escalation. More spectacle, larger stakes, bigger villains, more shocking deaths. The things that had made the show a cultural phenomenon in its golden age had been at their core about intimacy, about the specific texture of human relationships under extreme pressure, about small moments of grace in the middle of catastrophe. The strategy for maintaining the show at the top of the ratings, as Season 5's numbers began to settle and Season 6 approached, was to make it louder, to make the events bigger and the consequences more immediately dramatic. This strategy worked for a while. It worked through Season 5, which balanced the spectacle of the terminus escape with the genuine emotional weight of its character work. It worked through parts of Season 6, which introduced the show's most anticipated villain with enough craft and patience to make the anticipation feel earned. And then it arrived at a decision that would, in a single creative choice, crystallize everything that had been building since the day the network told Darabont that things were not working. and drove a crack through the show's relationship with its audience that the next several years of good individual episodes could not fully repair. The details of that decision, what it was and why it was made, and what it revealed about the kind of show The Walking Dead had become, are the center of the story that is coming. But before we arrive there, we need to spend some time with the years when the machine was running at full capacity, with what the show looked like when it was still, just barely, the show it had always intended to be, with the seasons that drew 17 million people to their televisions and made The Walking Dead into something that people argued about at work and obsessed over, online, and treated as appointment viewing in a way that required genuine emotional investment to sustain. Because the distance between what the show was in those years and what it became in the years that followed is the whole measure of what was lost. And you cannot fully understand what was lost unless you first understand what was there to lose. The peak of The Walking Dead was not a single moment. It was a sustained period from roughly the middle of Season 3 through the end of Season 5, with the high tide arriving in that October of 2014, when 17 million people sat down on a Sunday evening to find out how Rick and his people were going to escape from Terminus. That number, 17 million, belongs to some context if it is going to mean anything. At the time The Walking Dead was drawing those audiences, the average prime-time drama on a major broadcast network was drawing somewhere between 8 and 11 million viewers. The Walking Dead on basic cable, with a smaller available audience and a higher cable subscription cost, was outperforming network television's best dramas in the key demographic that advertisers cared most about. It was outperforming Sunday Night Football in that demographic on the nights when its season premieres aired. No show on basic cable had ever done what The Walking Dead was doing. The thing it had built, the audience that kept coming back every week and telling other people to come back with them, was the result of factors that had aligned in a way that could not be manufactured. A great source comic, a filmmaker with a vision, a British actor who found the soul of a Georgia sheriff, a production team that understood that the show's greatest effects were emotional rather than visual, and 4 years of Darabont refusing to accept that nobody wanted to see this story told. All of those things had combined, under conditions that were already beginning to erode, to make something genuinely extraordinary. And the numbers reflected that, not as a measure of quality in themselves, because audience size and artistic merit have never had a simple relationship, but as evidence that the show had found its audience, and that the audience had found in the show something worth returning to with the kind of consistency that is only ever the result of genuine attachment. And then behind the camera, at the level of the decisions being made about what kind of show this was going to be, now that it had reached the summit, the process of losing what had made it worth climbing to began. There is a specific way that a great television show feels when it is operating at its highest level. It is not a feeling that comes from any single element of what is being made, not from the performance alone, not from the writing alone, not from the direction, or the editing, or the score, or the production design. It comes from all of those things, working in alignment, each one serving the same vision, each one calibrated to produce the same emotional result. The feeling is something like being trusted, like the people who made this believe, without qualification, that you are capable of receiving what they're giving you, that you do not need everything explained, that you can sit with uncertainty and difficulty and the particular kind of quiet that precedes the most important moments, that you will follow the story wherever it needs to go, even when where it needs to go is somewhere you did not expect and did not necessarily want. The Walking Dead in its best years had that feeling, and the specific mechanics of how it produced that feeling, episode by episode and season by season, are worth examining in some detail, because understanding them is the only way to fully understand what was lost when the show moved away from them. The foundation of everything the show did well was character, not character in the abstract, as a general value that all television drama aspires to, but character in the very specific sense of individuals who had been built carefully enough and consistently enough that the audience understood their inner life without needing to have it explained. Characters whose choices, when they made them, felt like the inevitable product of who those specific people were, rather than the convenient requirement of the story that needed to happen around them. Rick Grimes was the most complex of these, and Andrew Lincoln's performance across the Golden Age years was the kind of sustained total commitment to a role that happens rarely enough in any era of television to deserve genuine recognition. Lincoln disappeared into Rick in a way that was almost unsettling when you stopped to think about it. The accent, the physicality, the texture of Rick's grief and determination, and the particular way those two things existed in simultaneous tension inside him at almost every moment of every episode, was so completely inhabited that it stopped registering as a performance and started registering as a person. What made Rick interesting was not that he was competent. Many television protagonists are competent. What made Rick interesting was his specific moral problem, the one that the show kept returning to across every season in different forms and under different pressures. He believed that the goal of survival was not simply to remain alive. He believed that survival without the preservation of a certain kind of humanity was not the goal at all. He kept trying to build something, a community with values, a small civilization inside the ruins of the larger one. He kept believing that this was possible and worth attempting, and the show kept testing that belief against circumstances designed precisely to challenge it. The governor challenged it from outside. Here was a man who'd built a community of his own, the town of Woodbury, and who had maintained it through methods that Rick's belief in civilization could not accommodate. The governor's settlement was functional, organized, and built on the willingness to do things that the residents of Rick's group had not yet fully accepted as necessary. The confrontation between Rick and the governor was not simply a conflict between good and evil. It was a confrontation between two versions of the same project: survival and community, and the attempt to build something human in an inhuman world, one of which had maintained its values, and one of which had concluded that values were a luxury that survival could not afford. That moral complexity, the refusal to let the villain be simply villainous, was characteristic of the show's Golden Age approach to antagonists. The governor was frightening, genuinely capable of terrible things, and entirely understandable as a human being who'd been destroyed and remade by the worst of what the world had become. He was not a monster from somewhere outside the human. He was a human being who had found, in the absence of the structures that normally constrain the worst of human possibility, that he was capable of becoming something he would not have recognized in himself before the world ended. Season 4 arrived after the governor's defeat and the destruction of the prison that had represented Rick's most sustained attempt at building something permanent, and it did something that many shows in its position would not have had the courage to do. It slowed down. It broke its ensemble apart and spent episode after episode with small groups of characters, sometimes just 2 or 3, working their way through both the physical landscape and the internal landscape of what had just happened to them. The bottle episodes of Season 4, the episodes that contained almost no action and almost no spectacle, and were built entirely on character revelation and moral reckoning, were among the finest hours in the show's history. The Grove was the most extreme of these and remains the most discussed. The episode follows Carol and Tyrese and the 2 girls, Mika and Lizzie, along with the infant Judith, as they shelter in a house along a railroad track leading toward a destination called Terminus. What the episode builds toward, with a patience and care that is unusual even by the standards of the show's best work, is a confrontation with a truth about one of the children that cannot be resolved by any of the usual mechanisms. What happens at the end of the episode, in a field of flowers where Carol tells Lizzie to look at the flowers, is one of the most morally serious moments in the history of American television drama. It is a moment that the show earns completely, because everything leading up to it has been built with the specific intention of making the audience understand why there is no other choice, and why the absence of any other choice is precisely the tragedy. The episode was written by Scott Gimple and directed by Michael Satrazemis. Its Rotten Tomatoes score is 100%. Critics writing about it use language they generally reserve for literature rather than genre television. The Atlantic called it devastating and essential. Entertainment Weekly's review noted that it was the kind of episode that justified the existence of the medium as an art form. It is not an episode that tries to be entertaining in the usual sense. It is an episode that tries to be true, and in being true becomes something that is much harder to achieve than entertainment and much more lasting. That episode arrived in Season 4 under Gimple's stewardship and after the firing of Darabont and through the messy transitional seasons that had preceded it, which tells you something important about the nature of what was lost. The loss was not total. The golden age was not ended by a single decision or a single personnel change. The conditions that had made it possible were degrading, but the creative talent that had been assembled around the show was real, and the knowledge of what the show could be at its best was present and occasionally acted upon for longer than the simple narrative of decline acknowledges. Season 5 was where everything that the show could do came together one final time at something approaching full strength. The premiere, No Sanctuary, opened with the escape from Terminus, a location that had been built in the Season 4 finale as the apparent destination of hope for all the separated characters. The episode revealed Terminus as a trap, a slaughterhouse run by survivors who had decided that the only sustainable response to the apocalypse was cannibalism. It was spectacle done with purpose, the action serving the show's ongoing argument about what survival cost and who you became in its service, rather than existing simply for its own sake. The season that followed navigated between Alexandria, the walled community that represented another version of Rick's attempt to build something permanent, and the wolves and Morgan's return, and the question of whether the people who had survived what Rick's group had survived could ever fully reintegrate into a community built around the rules and expectations of the world that had existed before everything changed. It was doing what the show did best, using the external drama of the post-apocalyptic world as a container for genuinely difficult internal drama about identity and community and the price of survival. The season averaged 14.38 million same-day viewers. The premiere drew 17.29 million. Those are numbers that no cable drama had ever produced before, and that very few have produced since. They were the product of a show that had, over 5 seasons, built a genuine emotional bond with an audience that trusted it to take them somewhere real and difficult and worth going. That trust was real, and it was, in the nature of trust, vulnerable. It could be extended and maintained only as long as the show continued to treat it seriously. The moment it was used for something other than storytelling, the moment it became a tool rather than an outcome, something fundamental in the relationship between the show and its audience would change. That moment was coming. It was coming in the season finale of Season 6, in a specific creative decision that the show's producers would later describe as designed to make people feel a particular way. And the description of the decision in those terms, as a design for producing a feeling rather than as the honest outcome of a story being told with integrity, was itself the most revealing thing about what the show had become. But before we arrive at that decision, it is worth sitting for a while with what existed before it. With the specific episodes and the specific performances and the specific moments that made The Walking Dead, in its golden age, genuinely great. Because those things are real, and they are not diminished by what followed them. They are what the show was before success asked it to be something else, and they are worth remembering carefully, because the distance between those things and what replaced them is the whole story. Daryl Dixon was never in Robert Kirkman's comic books. He was an invention of the television production, created because the show had hired Norman Reedus for a role that did not ultimately work out, and the producers had been unwilling to simply release him. The character of Daryl began as an antagonist of sorts, the younger and angrier brother of Merle, a man defined by hostility and the particular wounded pride of someone who had been failed by every institution and relationship that might have given him a different kind of person to be. What happened to Daryl over the first several seasons of the show was one of the more careful pieces of character development in the Golden Age. The show did not simply soften him. It did not turn him into a different kind of person by removing the things that had made him difficult and replacing them with more conventionally appealing traits. Instead, it traced the specific process by which a person who's been shaped entirely by neglect and anger and the need for self-sufficiency begins very gradually and not without resistance to find that there are people whose presence makes the world different. Not easier, not safer, just different. Worth something in a way that the world had not previously seemed worth anything to him. His relationship with Carol was one of the show's most genuinely felt connections, precisely because it was never sentimentalized. Two people who had been shaped by damage finding in each other's company, something that did not require either of them to be different from what they were. Carol had spent years in an abusive marriage. She had survived it and been changed by the surviving in ways that the show traced with patience and honesty across many episodes. By season 4 and 5, she had become something that the person she had been in season 1 would not have recognized. Not because she had healed exactly, but because she had found what she was capable of when the usual constraints were removed. The Grove was the episode that held that transformation up to the light most directly, and it did not flinch at what it found. Michonne arrived in season 3 and became, over the seasons that followed, one of the most complete characters the show produced. She was introduced as pure archetype, the silent warrior with the katana and the two armless walker companions who'd been the subject of considerable advance excitement among comic readers. The show could have left her as archetype. It would have been easier and probably commercially safe, given how strongly the audience responded to that initial impression. Instead, it spent episode after episode revealing the person underneath the archetype. The grief that had produced the warrior, the intelligence and the humour and the particular quality of someone who had decided, after losing everything, to be present in the world anyway. Her relationship with Rick, which built slowly and without announcement through the middle seasons until it had become the emotional core of the show, was the kind of connection that the show in its golden age knew how to build. Through shared experience rather than declared feeling. Through the accumulation of small moments rather than the dramatic announcement of large ones. Glenn and Maggie, together from the second season onward, were the show's most direct argument that love was possible in the world the story was depicting. Not easy, not simple, not protected from what the world was doing to everyone else, but real and worth fighting for, and a reason to keep choosing survival when the cost of survival kept rising. Their story, from the awkward beginning in season 2 through the marriage and the pregnancy, and the years of protecting each other through things that should have been impossible to survive, was the show's version of hope. Not optimism. The show was never optimistic in any facile sense, but hope which is different. The specific, difficult, eyes-open conviction that the people you love are worth whatever it costs to be present with them. All of these characters in the Golden Age seasons had room to be complicated, room to fail and know they had failed, room to change and have that change accumulate into something that felt like growth rather than simply like the mechanical requirements of the plot. The show trusted them enough to let them be wrong and to let the wrongness have consequences that lasted longer than a single episode. That trust in the characters, the willingness to let them take up space and time, and the creative resources of the production without immediately demanding that everything they did produce something dramatic, was what the Golden Age had, and that the later seasons, for reasons that were structural as much as they were individual, creative failures, could not sustain. The structure was changing, the conditions were changing, and the change was about to arrive at a moment that would make it impossible to ignore any longer. Every relationship between a television show and its audience is built on a form of trust. Not an agreement exactly, not a contract in any enforceable sense. Something more informal and more fundamental than that. An understanding established through the accumulation of many individual experiences about what kind of thing this is and what it is for. The audience learns, episode by episode and season by season, what the show is willing to do and why. They learn whether its shocking moments exist in service of its characters or in service of the shock itself. They learn whether its emotional weight is earned or manufactured. They learn, gradually, and without always consciously registering the lesson, whether the show is using them or trusting them. The Walking Dead had spent 5.5 seasons building a specific kind of trust with its audience. The trust that the difficult moments were difficult because the story required them to be. That the deaths of characters the audience had come to love were the honest outcome of the story the show was telling, rather than strategic decisions made to produce a measurable emotional response. That the grief the show asked its viewers to feel was not being extracted from them like a resource to be harvested, but shared with them as a genuine consequence of the story's reality. That trust was real, and it was precious in the way that all earned things are precious. It had been built slowly, through the specific cumulative experience of a show that had, season after season, demonstrated that it was willing to take genuine risks for the sake of genuine storytelling. Sophia in the barn, Herschel on his knees, the grove, the constant willingness to let the story go places that were difficult and irreversible, and that left the audience sitting with something they could not simply set aside when the credits rolled. The Season 6 finale of The Walking Dead aired on the 3rd of April 2016, and in the space of approximately 45 minutes of television, it began the process of spending that trust in a way that the seasons that followed could never fully replenish. The episode was titled Last Day on Earth, and it followed Rick's group as they attempted to transport Maggie, who was experiencing a dangerous complication with her pregnancy, to a doctor at the Hilltop community. The journey became a series of escalating obstacles, each one revealing that the Saviours, the group led by the villain the show had been building toward for the second half of the season, had an operational reach, an organisational discipline that Rick had consistently underestimated. Road after road was blocked. Every attempt at an alternate route arrived at another barrier. The trap was closing, and the closing was handled with genuine craft, the tension building methodically and the sense of helplessness growing with each failed attempt to find a way through. And then the group was on their knees in the dark. And then Negan arrived. Jeffrey Dean Morgan walked out of an RV in the Georgia night wearing a leather jacket and carrying a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, and introduced himself in a monologue that was, in terms of pure performance, one of the finest pieces of work in the show's entire run. He was charismatic and theatrical, and genuinely frightening in the specific way that certain human beings who have embraced the absence of restraint are frightening. Not as monsters from somewhere outside the human, but as a version of what humanity is capable of becoming when it decides that the usual rules no longer apply to it. The threat Negan represented was clear. One of the people on their knees in front of him was going to die. He was going to kill one of them to establish the new order of things. I hope to make concrete and irreversible the message that Rick's group was now under his authority. And then he was going to leave the rest of them alive to go back and tell others what they had witnessed, because the dead could not fear him, and the fearful could be useful. He He made his choice. He swung the bat, and the show cut to a point of view, shot from the ground. Camera shaking and tilting, the sound of the bat connecting once and again with something that was no longer responding, and then cut to black. The audience did not find out who had been killed for 7 months. That decision, the decision to withhold the answer to the question the season finale had made the most urgent question in the show's history, produced a response that revealed exactly how much trust the show had accumulated and exactly what it had done with it. The initial reaction was rage, not disappointment, not frustration. Rage of the specific and personal kind that people feel when they believe they have been genuinely betrayed by something they trusted. Social media was immediate and comprehensive in its condemnation. Critics who had praised the show for years wrote pieces that were not simply negative reviews of a bad creative decision, but expressions of something closer to grief. The grief of watching something you believed in reveal that it did not fully deserve the belief you had extended. The argument against the cliffhanger was not that shocking. Deaths were wrong, or that the show should not be allowed to kill major characters. And the show had always killed major characters. That was one of the specific things it had built its reputation on. The argument was about the distinction between a death that the story had earned and a death that was being withheld as a commercial mechanism. The season finale had built an elaborate dramatic architecture specifically to produce the maximum possible emotional investment in a question that the show was then deliberately declining to answer. It was using the audience's attachment to its characters not as the natural outcome of good storytelling, but as a lever, a way of generating engagement between seasons that would ensure people came back in October to find out what they had been denied in April. The word that kept appearing in the critical response was manipulation. Not every creative decision that produces strong emotions in an audience is manipulation. The Grove had produced devastating emotional responses in its audience, and nobody called it manipulation because the emotional responses arrived as the honest consequence of a story that had been told with complete integrity. What happened in the Season 6 finale was different. The emotional investment being harvested had not been produced by the storytelling in the finale. It had been produced by 5.5 seasons of accumulated attachment to characters who are now being used as hostages in a rating strategy. The Season 7 premiere arrived on October 23rd, 2016. It answered the question. Negan had killed 2 members of the group, Abraham Ford, who had died with the kind of defiant dignity that was consistent with who he had always been, and Glenn Rhee. Glenn's death was the one that mattered to the audience, in the way that the show had apparently expected both deaths to matter. Not because Abraham was not a character people cared about, but because Glenn had been there since the 2nd episode of the 1st season. Because Glenn had been the show's clearest argument that basic human decency could survive in the world the story depicted. Because Glenn and Maggie together were the show's version of hope, and the audience had watched that hope build over 6 seasons into something that was both fragile and fierce and enormously worth protecting. Because Maggie was pregnant. Because the scene in the premiere, Glenn calling out Maggie's name while Negan continued to beat him, Dewey was the kind of moment that the show's best work had always been capable of producing, but that arrived here in a context that had been contaminated by everything that had preceded it in the finale. The Season 7 premiere drew 17.03 million viewers. The largest single-episode audience the show had produced since the Season 5 premiere. The cliffhanger had worked in the narrow commercial sense. People had come back. They had come back because they needed to know, and then many of them did not come back again. The Season 8 premiere, which arrived exactly 1 year later, drew 11.4 million viewers. The drop of approximately 5.6 million viewers between the Season 7 and Season 8 premieres was one of the largest single-season audience losses in the history of a successful American television drama. The number is striking enough on its own. Its context makes it more striking. The show had not produced a bad season. Season 7 had been controversial, particularly in its first half, which many critics and viewers felt had leaned too heavily into the spectacle of Negan's cruelty at the expense of narrative momentum. But it was not a catastrophically poor piece of television. Season 8, which concluded the all-out war storyline, had significant problems with pacing and character logic, but it also contained individual episodes of genuine quality. The loss of those 5.5 million viewers was not a response to the creative quality of the television in front of them. It was a response to the betrayal of trust that the Season 6 finale had represented. The people who left between Season 7 and Season 8 were not leaving because they had decided the show was bad. They were leaving because the Season 6 finale had taught them something about the show that they could not unknow. What it had taught them was that the show was willing to use their emotional investment in ways that had nothing to do with telling a story, that the grief and attachment they had built over years of watching were resources that the production was prepared to harvest for commercial purposes, that the trust they had extended was not being reciprocated in kind. This is a specific and serious kind of damage to inflict on a relationship between a creative work and its audience. It is not the kind that can be repaired by subsequent good work, because it changes the context in which subsequent good work is received. After the Season 6 finale, the audience watched The Walking Dead with a knowledge they had not had before. They knew the show was capable of that, and once you know that about a show, you cannot watch it the same way. The emotional readiness that great television requires, the willingness to be present and open to what the story is doing, is conditioned on a basic trust that the story is being told in good faith. The Season 6 finale had given the audience reason to doubt that good faith. And the absence of good faith is not a condition that great storytelling can fully compensate for, because great storytelling requires the audience to meet it halfway, and the audience can only meet it halfway if they believe that the halfway they are walking toward is worth walking toward. The show's producers were not unaware of the response. Scott Gimple addressed it in several interviews, explaining that the decision had been made in the spirit of remaining true to the source material, in which the identity of Negan's victim was similarly withheld from readers through a similar cliffhanger. This explanation was received with limited sympathy, both because the television medium and the comics medium have different relationships with their audiences and different expectations about what a season finale represents, and because the argument that fidelity to the source material required the decision did not account for the many significant departures from the source material that the show had made over its run, when those departures served the story better than fidelity would have. More revealing in retrospect was an observation that surfaced in the discussion around the decision. The Season 5 premiere had drawn 17.3 million viewers. The Season 6 finale had drawn, for the same network, in the same time slot, at the culmination of a season that had consistently been praised as a creative return to form, approximately 14 million viewers. The show's audience had been declining across Season 6 despite the quality of the season's work. The cliffhanger, whatever else it was, he had successfully generated the kind of attention that brought people back for the Season 7 premiere in numbers that exceeded anything the show had produced since its all-time peak. It had worked. As a commercial strategy, as a mechanism for arresting a ratings decline and generating the kind of cultural conversation that drove viewership on premiere night, it had worked. And the fact that it had worked meant that the logic that produced it, the logic that treated the audience's emotional investment as a resource to be managed and deployed rather than as the natural outcome of good storytelling, was validated. Not just acceptable, validated. The numbers said it was the right call. What the numbers did not say, because numbers do not measure the things that matter most in the relationship between a show and its audience. Was what it cost. They did not say what the Season 6 finale took from the show in terms of the specific quality of trust that makes the difference between television that is merely watched and television that is genuinely inhabited. They did not say how the damage would compound over the seasons that followed, as the audience that remained brought with them the knowledge of what the show had done, and watched everything that came after through the filter of that knowledge. The Walking Dead had survived its cancellations, and its budget cuts, and its showrunner changes. It had survived the loss of its founding creative vision, and the commercial pressures that had reshaped it. It had survived in the sense that the machine kept running, and the numbers stayed large, and the merchandise kept selling, and the network kept ordering seasons. But something that had been at the core of what the show was, at its best, had been traded for something else, and the trade would prove, over the seasons that followed, to be the kind that you cannot undo simply by deciding you regret it. The relationship between The Walking Dead and its audience had changed, and the person who'd been the anchor of that relationship for 6 years, the one whose presence had given the audience their primary reason for returning week after week, was about to leave. There are stories that belong to a specific person, not in the legal sense of ownership, though that matters too, but in the deeper sense of belonging, the sense in which a story is inseparable from the specific voice and perspective and presence of the person telling it. These are stories where the protagonist is not simply the character at the centre of the narrative, but the lens through which the entire world of the story is perceived, calibrated, and made meaningful. Take the protagonist away, and you do not simply have a story with a vacancy at its centre. You have a different story entirely, using the same setting and the same supporting characters, but organised around a different principle of attention, a different set of concerns, a different relationship between what the camera chooses to look at and why. The Walking Dead was Rick Grimes' story. It had been from the moment he opened his eyes in that hospital room in Atlanta and reached for the water glass that was not there and stumbled out into a silence that had once been a world. But every horror that the show depicted had been processed through Rick's experience first. Every moral question the show raised had been asked against the backdrop of Rick's specific belief that those questions had answers worth fighting for. Every death that had mattered most to the audience had mattered because of what it did to Rick, what it asked of him, what it revealed about the limits of his capacity to remain the person he had decided to be. The audience's connection to the show was, in its deepest structure, a connection to Rick, not exclusively. The show had assembled a remarkable ensemble, and many of those characters had earned the audience's profound attachment in their own right. Daryl, Carol, Michonne, Glenn, Maggie, Morgan, Herschel. These were people the audience had lived with. In the specific way that television allows you to live with characters you have followed across years of their lives, and the connections were real. But Rick was the spine. He was the organising principle. He was the one whose presence gave the whole thing its shape and its direction and its reason for continuing. On July 22nd, 2018, Andrew Lincoln stood on the stage at San Diego Comic-Con and confirmed what had been reported and speculated about for weeks. He was leaving The Walking Dead at the beginning of Season 9. Lincoln had played Rick Grimes since the spring of 2010, when he was cast in a role that the show's producers had not initially expected to fill with an actor of his background and training. He was British. His accent was the clipped English of someone who had trained in the classical tradition. Rick Grimes spoke with a Georgia drawl that Lincoln had worked on with a dialect coach and maintained through 8 seasons of production without it ever becoming a performance. It had become, for anyone who had watched the show from the beginning, simply Rick's voice. The voice of the character was inseparable from the voice of the actor in the way that the best performances always make the construction invisible. Lincoln's explanation for his decision was, in the manner of the man who had given Rick his specific quiet dignity, entirely straightforward. He had 2 young children living in the United Kingdom. When the show had started, the filming schedule had run approximately 4.5 months per year. As the show had grown, and as the episode order had increased, the schedule had grown with it, reaching 8 months of production per year by the time Lincoln was preparing to leave. With press obligations added to that, he was spending approximately 2.5 months per year in the United Kingdom with his family. The children were getting older. They were less portable, as he put it. They needed their father to be present in a way that the demands of playing the lead role in the most watched show on cable television made impossible. It was time to come home. Those were his words, simple and complete, and not available for reinterpretation. The decision was understood and respected by everyone connected to the show, including the people who understood most clearly what it meant for the future of the production. Robert Kirkman, who had created the character and had watched Lincoln inhabit him for nearly a decade, expressed his support without qualification. The cast, many of whom had spent 8 seasons alongside Lincoln, and who spoke about him with the specific warmth of people who had been through significant things together, responded with the kind of solidarity that the show had always fostered, behind the camera, even when what was happening in front of it was chaos. What the decision meant for the show was not immediately clear to the audience, and would only become clear over the seasons that followed. There were reasons to believe in the summer of 2018 that the show could survive the transition. It had a remarkable ensemble. It had Angela Kang as a new showrunner, here following Scott Gimple's move to a broader executive role overseeing the expanding Walking Dead universe. Kang had written some of the finest episodes in the show's history and brought to the production a genuine understanding of what the show did best. There was the possibility that what followed Rick's departure would be a different kind of show, organised around different characters and different concerns, but still pursuing the same fundamental ambitions. Lincoln's final episode, which aired on November 4th, 2018, was the 5th episode of Season 9, titled What Comes After. It was, by the near-unanimous consensus of critics and longtime viewers, one of the finest individual episodes the show had produced since its golden age. It followed Rick in the hours after he was seriously injured, trying to control a herd of walkers that threatened both of the communities that had been built in the years since the Savior's defeat. Gravely wounded and unable to do what he had done so many times before, Rick spent the episode in a hallucinatory state, revisiting the faces of the people he had lost, the people whose deaths had shaped him into what he had become. The episode contained what many viewers considered the most fully realised performance Lincoln had given in 8.5 seasons of the role. There was a scene with Scott Wilson, who played Herschel Green and who had died in reality the month before the episode aired, that arrived as both an episode of the story and a genuine farewell to a man the cast and crew had loved. There was a quality to the whole episode of something being completed, a story that had started with Rick alone in a hospital bed, trying to understand what had happened to the world while he slept, reaching its fullest expression in the form of Rick alone on a bridge, trying to understand what it had all been for. Rick survived the bridge. The explosion that seemed to end his story actually removed him from it, delivering him into the custody of the Civic Republic military and the helicopter that had appeared in the background of the show's story since very early in the first season. He was alive, he was gone. The door to his return was open. It had been left open deliberately because AMC had plans for a series of films that would follow Rick's story in the time he spent away from the people he loved. Those films did not materialise in the form they had been announced. The pandemic disrupted the first plans. The show's declining ratings between the announcement of the films and the moment when production would have begun changed the calculus. What eventually emerged years later was a 6-episode limited series titled The Walking Dead, The Ones Who Live, which reunited Lincoln with Danai Gurira's Michonne and told the story of Rick's years in the custody of the Civic Republic. It was received warmly. It gave the characters the ending their story deserved. But it arrived after years of the audience waiting and wondering and watching the main series continue without its centre. And those years had changed the audience's relationship with the larger story in ways that a 6-episode reunion could address but could not fully repair. The seasons after Rick's departure were not without quality. Angela Kang's stewardship of the show, from season 9 through season 11, demonstrated consistently that the talent assembled around the production was real, and the commitment to serious storytelling remained present. Season 9's second half, The Whisperer's Arc, was some of the most genuinely unsettling television the show had produced in years. The Whisperers, a community of survivors who wore the skins of walkers and moved among the dead, were the show's most conceptually disturbing antagonists. Since the governor, and were handled with enough craft to suggest that the show, under different leadership and with a reduced audience expectation to manage, was still capable of ambitious work. But the audience had changed. Not just in size. Though the size had changed dramatically, the audience that remained had been altered by everything that had happened. By the season 6 finale and the trust it had spent. By Glenn's death and the way it had been extracted from 6 seasons of character investment rather than earned by the story of the moment it occurred in. By Rick's departure and the specific way it had been handled, the explosion and the helicopter and the promise of films that did not come, which had left the audience hanging over a gap that was supposed to be temporary and turned out to be years long. The audience still watching The Walking Dead after season 9 was watching a show that had lost its protagonist, had promised to return him and had not, had experienced 3 showrunner changes in 9 seasons, had seen its finest character deaths instrumentalized for commercial purposes, and had watched its ratings decline from 17 million to something that looked, from the outside, like a slow and ungraceful retreat from relevance. There were viewers who found in the post-Rick seasons things worth watching: The Whisperer's Arc, the return of Morgan, Carol's extended storyline. The Commonwealth, the large and politically complex community that occupied the final seasons, had genuine ambition and did things that the show at its best had always done. Used the external drama of the post-apocalyptic world to illuminate something true about power and community and the specific ways that human institutions reproduce the hierarchies and injustices of the world that preceded them. But none of it drew anything like the audiences that had made The Walking Dead the biggest show on cable television. By the time the 11th and final season aired, the audience had contracted to a fraction of its peak. The first episode of the 11th season drew approximately 2.22 million same-day viewers, a number that was, in the context of what the show had once been, both a remarkable act of endurance and a clear signal of the distance that had been travelled. 17 million at the peak, 2 million at the end. The distance between those numbers is the whole story of what happens when a show survives long enough to outlive the conditions that made it worth watching. Not because the people making it stopped caring or stopped trying, but because the particular circumstances that had produced the thing the audience loved most, the filmmaker with a vision, the actor who found the soul of a character, the network that was willing to let something slow and difficult and morally serious occupy its most valuable time slot, was a combination that could not be reconstituted once the pieces were moved. What had made the Golden Age possible was, in the nature of such things, unrepeatable. And the people making the show knew this, even as they kept going, even as they kept finding moments of genuine quality within the machine that had replaced the original creative urgency. They kept going because people were still watching, because the story had not finished yet, and there were people who cared how it ended. And the ending, when it finally came, was a good one, a graceful one. The kind of ending that acknowledged everything that had been built and everything that had been lost and chose to face the future rather than dwell on the past. But the ending could not restore what the beginning had been. And the beginning, Those 6 episodes that Daryl had shot on 16mm film in the summer of 2010, with a cast who did not yet know what any of this would become, and a network that was taking a risk it could not fully calculate, remained the thing that the show had been before success changed the conditions and the conditions changed the show. The departure of Rick Grimes was not the end of The Walking Dead. It was the moment when it became impossible to pretend that the show which continued was the same show that had earned the love that was keeping it alive. There is a pattern that runs through the history of successful creative projects that become commercial institutions. It is not a simple pattern, and it is not one that anyone inside it tends to recognize clearly while it is happening. But it is consistent enough across enough different kinds of creative work, across enough different eras and industries, that it has something of the quality of a natural law, something that is going to happen once certain conditions are met, regardless of the intentions of the people involved, because the conditions themselves generate the outcome. The pattern works like this. A creative project succeeds. The success attracts resources that were not previously available. The resources create opportunities that the original conditions of the project did not include. The people responsible for the project pursue some of those opportunities because the resources exist and the opportunities are real, and the desire to do more with what has been built is entirely natural. In pursuing those opportunities, they create structures and commitments and institutional obligations that were not part of the original project. Those structures and commitments and obligations begin to influence the decisions being made about the original project, because the original project is now generating the resources that support everything else, and the influence tends to move in a specific direction toward the kinds of decisions that protect the resources, that maintain the audience, and the revenue and the institutional relationship that has been built, rather than toward the kinds of decisions that risk any of those things in the pursuit of something genuinely new. This is not cynicism. It is not a story about bad people making wrong choices for selfish reasons. The people who built The Walking Dead were, by every available account, people who cared about what they were making and who wanted it to be good. Frank Darabont cared. The people who replaced him cared. Andrew Lincoln cared so deeply about Rick Grimes that he spent 8 months of every year away from his family, for 8 years, to do the character justice. The writers who worked through the later seasons were talented professionals doing serious work under difficult conditions. The pattern is not about caring or not caring. It is about the specific way that the conditions of production change when a creative project becomes a commercial institution, and the specific way that those changed conditions gradually, but inevitably, alter what can be made. The Walking Dead became a commercial institution faster and more completely than almost any other cable drama in the history of the medium. The 75-episode run with more than 10 million weekly viewers was unprecedented. The merchandise revenue was enormous. The show's cultural footprint at its height in the middle of the decade was comparable to the biggest dramas that prestige television had ever produced. People who had never watched the show knew who Rick Grimes was. The image of a man on a horse in front of an empty skyline had become one of the defining visual signatures of American television in the 2010s. All of that success created a machine, not metaphorically, literally, a production infrastructure organized around the reliable delivery of a product at a consistent quality level on a consistent schedule. Hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on that machine continuing to run. Merchandise partnerships and licensing agreements that required the show's characters to remain recognizable and consistent. Spin-off productions that needed the world of the original show to remain stable enough to be inhabited by new stories. A network whose financial health was meaningfully tied to the franchise's performance. An entire commercial ecosystem that had grown up around what had once been one filmmaker's vision for a story about survival and what it costs. When you are at the center of a machine of that scale, The creative decisions you make are no longer simply creative decisions. Every choice carries the weight of everything the machine depends on. Killing a beloved character does not just affect the story, it affects the licensing deals that include that character. It affects the spin-off that was planning to use them. It affects the audience that will stop watching if they lose the person they came for. It affects the merchandise that generates revenue between seasons. Every decision about story and character and the direction the show should take is also a decision about all of those other things. And the pressure of all of those other things does not sit in the room where the creative decisions are made as a theoretical weight. It sits there as the direct and immediate concern of specific people whose jobs are defined by managing it. This is why the later seasons of The Walking Dead made the decisions they made, not because the people making them lacked talent or commitment, but because the conditions in which they were making them had fundamentally changed from the conditions that had produced the Golden Age, and different conditions produce different work, regardless of the talent and commitment of the people doing the work. The Season 6 cliffhanger was not made by people who did not care about the show's integrity. It was made by people working within a system that had learned that from 5 years of managing a massive franchise, that certain kinds of decisions generated certain kinds of results. The cliffhanger generated 7 months of conversation and speculation. It drove the audience to come back in numbers that exceeded the show's declining trajectory. It worked within the commercial logic that the machine operated by. And within that logic, working is the most powerful argument available. The problem was that the machine's logic and the story's logic were no longer the same logic. The machine's logic was about maintaining and maximizing the audience. The story's logic was about telling the truth about survival and what it costs. Those two logics had been compatible, more or less, through the years when the show was building its audience, because the truth was also the thing that drew people in and kept them watching. But once the machine was fully operational, once the institutional structure that depended on the audience was large enough and complex enough that its needs were fully present in every creative decision, the two logics began to diverge. And the machine's logic, which had resources and institutional weight and the measurable evidence of ratings numbers behind it, tended to win. The showrunner changes contributed to this dynamic in ways that are worth understanding clearly. Frank Darabont had been the creative center of the show in the sense that he had built it from the ground up and carried in his specific vision the standard against which every decision could be measured. When he was removed, that standard was replaced not by a different standard of equal clarity, but by a more distributed creative process in which different talented people brought their own sensibilities to the work without any single overriding vision, providing the organizing principle. Glenn Mazzara was good at stabilizing a production in crisis. Scott Gimple was good at understanding the source material and honoring its most important moments. Angela Kang was good at character work and at finding the intimacy that the show at its best had always possessed. Each of these people was genuinely talented. None of them was Frank Darabont, not because Darabont was more talented than any of them in absolute terms, but because none of them had built this particular thing from nothing with this particular vision for this particular reason. A show made by the person who built it is different from a show made by talented professionals doing their best with the material they inherited. The difference is not always visible in any individual episode. It is visible in the cumulative direction that many episodes taken together produce, in whether the show is moving towards something specific or simply maintaining a standard that has already been established, in whether the creative decisions are being made from the inside of a vision or in service of one that preceded the people making the decisions. The Walking Dead after Darabont was being maintained. There were episodes and arcs and individual performances that exceeded anything that maintaining could produce, because the talent involved was real and occasionally found conditions in which it could operate at its highest level. But the organizing principle had changed. The question being asked behind the camera was no longer What does this story need to be true, but what does this franchise need to remain viable? And those are different questions that lead to different places. The franchise question was not asked cynically. The people asking it genuinely believed in most cases that the franchise's viability was important not just commercially, but creatively. That keeping the show alive meant keeping the story alive, that maintaining the audience was a prerequisite for telling the story to anyone at all. This is not an unreasonable argument. A show that nobody watches cannot tell any story to anyone. The commercial reality of television production is not separate from the creative reality in any simple sense. They are entangled in ways that make the clean separation between art and commerce that critics sometimes invoke as a standard essentially fictional. But the entanglement has consequences that the clean separation obscures. When the commercial reality begins to determine what the story can do, the story is no longer being told from the inside of its own logic. It is being told from the inside of the logic of a machine that has different priorities and different measures of success. And stories told from the inside of a machine's logic tend to feel like what they are, the product of a machine rather than the product of human beings working at the limits of what they can make, under conditions that demand the best they can give, because nothing less is going to be enough. The golden age of The Walking Dead felt like the latter. The later seasons, at their weakest, felt like the former. And the distance between those two feelings, which the audience sensed even when they could not always articulate precisely what had changed, is the distance between a show being made by people who needed it to be extraordinary, and a show being made by people who needed it to continue. The continuation happened. The production carried on. It produced 11 seasons of television and a franchise that extended beyond the original show into multiple spin-offs and a cultural legacy that will outlast the institutional structures that built it. It kept going long after the conditions that had made it worth starting were gone. That is its own kind of achievement, and it deserves to be recognised as such, because running the machine for 22 episodes a year across 11 seasons, while maintaining any standard at all, while producing any episodes that rose above the baseline of professional competence, was harder than it looked, and accomplished by people whose work deserved more credit than the narrative of decline tends to allow them. But a machine is not a vision, and the thing that had made The Walking Dead genuinely extraordinary, the thing that had drawn 17 million people to their televisions on a Sunday night in October of 2014, was not the machine. It was the vision that had preceded the machine, built from a filmmaker's ambition and an actor's total commitment, and a story that took seriously the question of what it means to remain human when humanity is no longer the dominant condition of the world. That vision had been present in the production in full for one season. It had been present in diminished but still potent form for several seasons after that. And then the machine had grown large enough that the vision was no longer driving the decisions. The machine was driving the decisions. And the machine made choices that the vision would not have made, because the machine was optimizing for different outcomes. The most consequential of those choices, after the Season 6 cliffhanger, was the decision about how to manage the Walking Dead universe as the original show's audience continued to decline. The answer that AMC reached, the answer that any commercial institution operating in its position would have been likely to reach, was expansion. If the universe itself had value, if the world and its characters and its specific vision of what survival means could generate interest beyond the original series, then more of the universe was the right response to the challenges facing the original. The age of the Walking Dead spin-offs had begun. There is a specific episode that crystallizes the machine problem more clearly than almost any other moment in the show's post-peak run. The episode is Season 8's mid-season finale, titled How It's Gotta Be. By this point in the all-out war storyline, the show had spent a full season and a half building toward the climactic confrontation between Rick's coalition and Negan's saviors. He's a confrontation that the comics had handled with genuine dramatic weight, and that the television adaptation was struggling to translate into something with equivalent urgency. The mid-season finale of Season 8, titled How It's Gotta Be, revealed that Carl Grimes had been bitten. Carl, who had been present since the first episode, who had grown from the small boy in the sheriff's hat into the young man who had become the show's argument that the next generation could carry forward what the survivors had fought to build, had been bitten while leading a stranger named Siddiq to safety. He died in the following episode, Honor, the mid-season premiere, spending his final hours saying goodbye to his father and the family he had protected for 8 seasons. The show made a choice to let him say those goodbyes at length and with genuine care, and it was one of the better hours of the later seasons. But the decision to kill Carl at all was handled in a way that many long-time viewers found difficult to accept. Glenn's death had been drawn from the source material. Carl's death was a departure from it, made for reasons that the showrunners would explain as providing emotional momentum for Rick's decision to spare Negan at the end of the war. What was lost when Carl died was not simply a character, it was the show's future. In the comics, Carl survived and grew into the protagonist of a final arc set years after the main story's conclusion, carrying forward everything his father had fought for. His death in the television version closed a door that the show had been building towards since Season 1, and the audience felt the loss, not only as grief for a specific character, but as the removal of one of the show's central promises about what all of this had been for. The machine had made a decision that the story, told from the inside of its own logic, would not have made, and the audience felt the difference. Fear the Walking Dead launched in 2015. It was positioned as a companion series that would explore the beginning of the outbreak, the period that the original show had explicitly avoided depicting because Darabont had understood, correctly, that the moment of collapse was less interesting than what happened after it, when the shape of the new world was still being negotiated, and the people surviving in it were still deciding who they were going to be. The companion series premise was commercially sensible and creatively audacious. Going back to the start of the outbreak meant building a new cast of characters whose history with the audience would be zero at the moment the show began. It meant asking people to invest in new people in a way that the original show had built that investment gradually and carefully across many hours of television before it began to spend it, and it meant operating in a period of the story that the original show had implicitly argued was less fertile dramatically than the world the survivors had inherited. Fear the Walking Dead found its audience. It ran for 8 seasons. It evolved in ways that surprised many of its critics, eventually finding in its later years a version of the show's identity that felt genuinely distinct from the original. But it never generated the cultural conversation or the audience size of the show it had branched from, and the question of whether its existence had diluted the value of the Walking Dead brand or extended it was one that different people answered differently depending on their perspective on what the brand's value actually consisted of. The Walking Dead World Beyond followed in 2020, a 2-season limited series aimed at a younger audience. It explored the Civic Republic, the mysterious organisation that had taken Rick Grimes and that had appeared in the background of the story since the show's early seasons. It was intended to provide narrative connective tissue between the main show's universe and the Rick Grimes film projects that had been announced. It was received with mixed reviews and modest ratings and was cancelled after its planned 2 seasons, having served its narrative bridging function without generating any particular enthusiasm for itself as a creative project in its own right. The more successful entries in the expanding universe came later. The Walking Dead, Dead City, which followed Negan and Maggie in a post-collapse Manhattan, managed to find genuine chemistry between Jeffrey Dean Morgan and Lauren Cohan, and to generate some of the most imaginative production design in the franchise's history. The Walking Dead, Daryl Dixon, which transplanted Norman Reedus's character to France, surprised many viewers by being considerably better than its premise suggested it had any right to be. And The Walking Dead, The Ones Who Live, which finally delivered on the promise of Rick's return, was received with genuine emotional investment from the portion of the original show's audience that had waited years for it. These were not bad shows. Several of them were, at their best, quite good. But the expansion of the universe raised a question that the commercial logic of franchise development does not like to ask directly, because the answer tends to complicate the logic. The question was this: if The Walking Dead is a story about what survival costs, about the specific moral weight of staying human in a world that keeps presenting you with reasons not to, about the relationship between violence and community, and the particular grief of losing people who are the reason you kept trying, then what does that story look like when it is distributed across 8 simultaneous television shows produced by different creative teams at different budget levels for different audiences? The answer, which the franchise's trajectory across the decade of its peak and decline suggests quite clearly, is that it looks like something that retains the surface features of the original story while losing the conditions that had made those features meaningful. It looks like the aesthetic of the Golden Age, the Georgia landscape and the ruined world, and the visual grammar that Greg Nicotiro's production design had established, deployed in the service of narratives that were producing those aesthetics for their brand recognition rather than because a creative vision required them. This is the spin-off problem. Not that spin-offs are inherently inferior to their originals. Some of the finest television in the history of the medium has been made by spin-offs that found their own identity and pursued their own creative logic with genuine independence from the properties that spawned them. The problem is particular to franchises where the original's power came from conditions, a filmmaker with a singular vision, a cast of characters developed over many years, a cultural moment when what the show was doing had not yet been done before, that cannot be recreated in a new production simply by using the same world and the same general premise and some of the same characters. The Walking Dead's golden age was not a formula that could be extracted and applied elsewhere. It was the product of things that existed once and never exactly again. The attempt to franchise it was not wrong as a business decision. It was simply an illustration of the general principle that what makes a creative achievement valuable is precisely its irreproducibility, and the attempt to reproduce it tends to produce something that resembles the achievement without possessing the quality that made it what it was. The audience for the franchise as a whole remained substantial across the era of expansion. AMC's streaming service, AMC Plus, grew significantly on the back of Walking Dead content. The individual spin-offs each found their audiences. The commercial case for expansion was defensible. But the relationship between the franchise and the culture was different from the relationship that the original show at its height had maintained. It was the relationship between a brand and its customers, rather than the relationship between a story and the people it had genuinely reached. The original show at its height had been the latter, something that people did not simply watch but lived inside between episodes. That occupied space in their imagination when the screen was dark. That produced conversations at work and arguments online that were arguments about the show's ideas, about what it was saying about survival and community and the cost of doing what is necessary, rather than simply about whether a particular episode had been entertaining or whether a particular character decision had been logical. That quality of genuine engagement, the kind that makes a television show part of the culture rather than simply part of the schedule, is not something that can be maintained indefinitely across any show regardless of quality, and it is not something that can be transferred to spin-offs regardless of how closely they adhere to the source material. It is the property of the right story told by the right people at the right moment in the right way. It is the product of conditions that align rarely and do not align twice in the same form. The Walking Dead's golden age had produced that alignment, and the awareness of what had been lost was not simply the awareness of diminished ratings or reduced cultural conversation. It was the awareness that something genuinely rare had been present and was present no longer. That the 17 million people who had watched the Season 5 premiere were watching something built under circumstances that could not be maintained, and that the franchise that grew up around the original thing was capable of many things, but was not capable of recreating what it was built around. The story of The Walking Dead's golden age is not in the end a story of failure. This needs to be said clearly and meant seriously, because the narrative of decline, which is the narrative this video has been tracing, can be misleading if it is not carefully bounded. The Walking Dead was not a great show that became a bad one. It was a great show that became an institutional one, which is a different kind of transformation and a more complex one. The golden age of The Walking Dead produced television that belongs, without qualification, among the finest drama that the American medium has ever made. Days Gone By is still the best pilot episode in the history of cable drama. The Grove is still one of the 10 finest individual hours of television in the history of the medium. The sustained performance that Andrew Lincoln gave across 8 seasons of the role is still, as a body of work, one of the great achievements of television acting in any era. The moral seriousness that the show brought to its central question about what survival costs and whether the cost can ever be paid without losing what made survival worth having was genuine and rare, and treated with a care that the later seasons, whatever their quality, could not fully match because they were operating under conditions that did not allow the same kind of care. Those things are real. They are still there, unchanged, in the episodes themselves. They are available to anyone who wants to find them, exactly as they were when they first aired. Carrying everything they were built to carry, asking everything they were built to ask. The machine that grew up around them does not reach back and take them away. The decisions that were made in the service of the franchise's commercial health do not alter the specific quality of what existed before those decisions were made. The decline of the later seasons is real, and the golden age is also real. Both things exist simultaneously, in the same catalogue, under the same title card, accessible through the same streaming platforms, and subject to the same royalty agreements. What the story of their coexistence actually describes is something that is both sad and clarifying about the nature of creative achievement and what happens to it when it succeeds. It describes the specific, painful irony at the centre of the whole arc. The conditions that made the Golden Age possible were, by their nature, conditions that the show's success would destroy. The hunger and urgency and creative risk that Darabont had brought to the production were the products of someone who had been trying to get this story made for 4 years and was not sure he would ever succeed. Once he succeeded, those qualities were gone. Not gradually, essentially immediately. The day the show was renewed, the day it drew 5 million viewers, the day AMC decided it was worth fighting for rather than allowing to remain the small, difficult, ambitious thing it had been, the ground began to shift. The fight to get the show made had been what gave the show its texture. The willingness to treat a zombie story as a serious moral inquiry about the nature of humanity had been the product of someone who had spent 4 years being told that nobody wanted to hear it and had made it anyway. The specific quality of desperation and conviction that marked every frame of the first season was the quality of work made by someone who did not know if they would get another chance and was making the most of this one. That quality does not survive the guarantee of renewal. It cannot. Once the show was a hit, once the money was arriving and the audience was measured in millions, and the network was ordering additional episodes before the current ones had finished airing, the people making it were no longer making it from the position of someone who might not get another chance. They were making it from the position of people who would be making it next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, because the commercial reality of what the show had become made stopping it more complicated than continuing. And continuing, as any creative person who has spent years on a single project can tell you, is a different thing from beginning. It requires different qualities and rewards different instincts, and produces different work. Not necessarily worse work. Sometimes continuing produces something that could not have existed at the beginning, because the depth of knowledge and the accumulated understanding of what the material can do only arrives through the years. But the specific electricity of the beginning, the specific urgency of making something that might not survive long enough to be completed, is a quality that continuation cannot recreate. It is a quality that only exists once, and it is the quality that the audience felt most clearly in the first season of The Walking Dead and went back, in their millions, hoping to feel again. They were not wrong to keep looking for it. It appeared in moments across many subsequent seasons, in the barn sequence of Season 2, in the Governor's Arc of Season 3, in the Grove of Season 4, in pieces of Season 5 that retained the show's original moral seriousness, in individual performances and individual episodes that rose above the institutional pressures and produced something that felt, briefly, like the original. But what had made the thing they were looking for was gone. And what remained in its place was a machine, a very capable, very well-funded, professionally staffed machine producing reliable content in a world that it had built from nothing, and that it would keep building in diminishing increments for as long as the numbers justified continuing and nobody in a position of sufficient authority decided to stop. The machine ran until it did not. Until the 11th season concluded and the story reached its ending, and the characters found the version of the future that the show had always been arguing was worth fighting for. It was a good ending. It honoured what the beginning had promised. The last moments of the last episode contained the warmth and the earned hope that the show at its best had always been capable of producing. And then it was done. And what it left behind was everything it had been. All 11 seasons and all the spin-offs and all the merchandise and all the conversations and all the people who had felt, watching Rick ride into Atlanta on that horse, that something had arrived that was worth giving their full attention to. It had been worth it. That is the last thing this story needs to say. Whatever was lost along the way, whatever compromises were made and whatever trust was spent, and whatever the machine produced that fell short of what the vision had been, the thing at the centre of it, the story that Darabont had spent 4 years fighting to tell, had been worth it. Worth the fight, and worth the telling, and worth the watching, and worth the loss that came when success arrived, and changed the conditions, and the conditions changed the show. The Golden Age was real. The people who lived through it, who watched it as it aired and who are watching it now for the first time, and who will find it years from now and discover what it was, are right to value it as the thing it is. Something made by specific people under specific conditions that aligned once and produced something extraordinary. Something that sits comfortably among the best drama the medium has ever produced. Something that was worth making, and worth watching, and worth remembering as what it was. And the world that remained after it, the machine and its spin-offs and the declining numbers and the institutional weight of a franchise that had grown too large to be moved by anything as small as a single filmmaker's vision. That world was also real, and it was also, in its way, a tribute to what the original had been. Because you do not build a machine of that scale around something ordinary. You build it around something that was extraordinary. And the machine, whatever else it was the world's evidence that what Frank Darabont had spent 4 years fighting to make, and what Andrew Lincoln had spent 8 years in a different country to inhabit, and what the writers and directors and production designers and cast members of the Golden Age had given everything they had to produce, had been genuinely worth it. The machine was proof of the vision. The vision had built the machine, and the machine had eventually obscured the vision that it proved. That is the whole story, and it is, depending on how you hold it, either a tragedy or a triumph, or most honestly, both of those things at once. There is something worth sitting with in the quiet before this story is finished. Something that does not fit neatly into the narrative of rise and peak and decline that this video has been tracing. Something that the narrative of decline, which is a useful analytical frame and a true one, tends to obscure when applied too cleanly to something that was, in its full complexity, more difficult to categorize than any single story about it can capture. The Walking Dead ran for 11 seasons, 2010 to 2022. 12 years, 177 episodes of the main series with additional content across multiple spin-offs that continued beyond the main show's conclusion. It was the longest-running zombie story in the history of the medium by a significant margin. It is, by the measure of its peak ratings and its sustained cultural footprint across more than a decade, one of the most successful dramatic series that American cable television has ever produced. And somewhere in that run, the thing that had made it extraordinary, the alignment of a vision and the people who held that vision and the circumstances that allowed it to operate without the compromises that commercial success inevitably introduces, was lost. Not suddenly. Not because anyone decided to abandon it, but because what had produced it was destroyed by the very process of the show becoming what it needed to become for any of it to have had a lasting effect at all. Think about what that means for a moment. The show could not have built the audience that it built, could not have produced the 17 million people who watched the Season 5 premiere, could not have had the cultural impact that it had without becoming the kind of institution that could not sustain the conditions that made it worth building in the first place. The success was necessary for the work to reach the people it reached, and the success destroyed the conditions that produced the work that was worth reaching. This is not a paradox that is unique to The Walking Dead. It is, in various forms, the condition of almost every creative achievement that becomes a cultural institution. The Simpsons, in its golden age, was made by a group of writers and animators who were doing something that had never been done before and who were doing it under conditions that could not last, because the show they were making was building an audience that would eventually generate the commercial pressures that would make doing the same thing impossible. The Beatles produced their finest music during a period of creative urgency and artistic hunger that fame itself made unsustainable. Every great television show that has run long enough to outlive its own peak has traced some version of this same arc. The Walking Dead is not different from those things. It is the same thing, playing out across the conditions of cable television in the 2010s, with the personalities and decisions and institutional structures of AMC and the creative talents of the people it assembled, and the cultural moment when what it was doing had not yet been done, and therefore arrived with the force of something the medium had not seen before. What is worth carrying out of this story, beyond the narrative of what happened and why, is something about the nature of what was made during the years when the conditions were right, and the vision was present, and the work was happening from the most honest and urgent place that the people making it had access to. Frank Darabont made 6 episodes of television in the summer of 2010 that remain, in the judgment of critics and long-time viewers and people who encounter them for the first time now, among the finest drama the medium has produced. He made them under conditions that included a network that was taking a genuine risk, a cast that did not yet know what any of this would become, and 4 years of accumulated conviction about what this story was and why it was worth telling. He made them with a level of care and intentionality that is visible in every choice, from the decision to shoot on 16mm film to the decision to split the pilot into 2 episodes in order to take the time the characters deserved, to the decision to cast Andrew Lincoln, who was not the obvious choice because he was the right choice. The pilot episode of The Walking Dead, Days Gone By, holds a 9.2 score on the Internet Movie Database across more than 200,000 ratings as of the years since it aired. The The average rating for the show across its entire run dropped significantly below that mark in the later seasons. The audience knew what it was responding to. The audience knows the difference between work made from the inside of a vision and work made in service of an institution, even when it cannot always articulate the difference in the terms that critics and analysts use. Andrew Lincoln gave 8 years of his life to Rick Grimes. 8 years away from his children. 8 years of being present for 8 months of every year in a role that required the kind of total inhabitation that cannot be sustained from a comfortable distance. His performance in the final episode, What Comes After, was praised by almost every critic, who wrote about it as the finest work he had given in the role. The episode functioned simultaneously as the conclusion of Rick's journey and as Lincoln's farewell to a character he had built, detail by detail, over nearly a decade. The scene with Scott Wilson playing Herschel Green, who had died in reality in the same month the episode was filmed, was one of the most genuinely moving scenes in the show's entire run. It was made possible only by the 8 years that had preceded it, by all the episodes in which Lincoln had been present, fully and without reservation, in the life of this specific person in this specific world. That commitment was real. Whatever happened to the show around it, whatever decisions were made by the network and the production and the franchise development team, Lincoln's commitment to the character was constant. And it produced across 8 seasons a body of work in a single role that deserves to be recognized as one of the significant achievements in the history of the medium. Norman Reedus built Daryl Dixon from nothing, from a character who had no existence in the source material and who could have been disposable, but who became, through years of careful and committed work, the character that the audience most frequently cited when asked who kept them watching after Rick was gone. Daryl Dixon was proof of something the show had always argued, that the world it depicted was capable of producing people who exceeded what they had been before it arrived, and that survival, however brutal its requirements, did not have to mean the loss of the specific quality that made the person worth keeping. Daryl, in the later seasons, crossing the Atlantic to a different country, discovering new people and new stakes in a world that extended beyond everything he had known, was the show making good on a promise it had been building towards since he first appeared in Season 1 as someone who could have been nothing and chose, slowly and not without difficulty, to be something more. So Carol Pelletier's arc across 11 seasons remains one of the most fully realised character journeys in the history of American television drama. Melissa McBride gave to Carol what Lincoln gave to Rick, which was complete investment across every season in the specific reality of who this person was and what was happening to her, and what it cost. The journey from the quiet, abused woman of Season 1 to the person who walked into the grove in Season 4 and made the choice that the episode required of her, and who survived that choice and kept surviving and kept making choices across every subsequent season, was the show demonstrating at full strength that the original ambition had been real and had been realised. Whatever the machine produced in the later years, that arc was there, that work was done, that character was built, in over 12 years of filming, into something that earned the word great without apology. The final episode of the main series aired on November 20th, 2022. In its final minutes, it brought together the threads of what the show had been from the beginning. The survivors of Alexandria and Hilltop, and the Kingdom, and the Commonwealth, gathered in the rebuilt communities they had fought to make and maintain. The children who had grown up inside the apocalypse, who had never known the world before it ended, looking at a future that was not what anyone had imagined when the show began, but that was, in its way, the answer to the question the show had been asking since Rick had ridden into Atlanta on a horse. Was it worth it? Was the fight to remain human worth what it cost? Was the attempt to build something, over and over, in the ruins of the thing that had been destroyed, the right response to surviving in a world that kept presenting reasons not to try? The answer the show gave, in its final images, was yes. Not in a way that erased or diminished what had been lost along the way. Not in a way that pretended the cost had been manageable or the loss had been acceptable, but yes in the specific way that yes means anything after everything it has been through. Yes in the full knowledge of what no had looked like. Yes as the choice made by people who had seen the alternative and chosen not to become it. Judith Grimes, standing on the wall of Alexandria, looking out over the world that her father had fought to protect, telling her brother that they get to start over, that they are the ones who live. It was the right ending, or it honoured everything the beginning had promised. And it arrived as all meaningful endings do, carrying the full weight of everything that had come before it. The show that ended on that November evening was not the same show that had premiered on Halloween night of 2010. It had travelled too far and changed too much and lost too many of the people and conditions that had made it what it had been. But it was connected to that show by an unbroken chain of episodes, each one leading to the next, each one the product of specific people doing specific work under specific conditions, across 12 years of television that included the finest drama the genre has produced, and also included the particular kind of institutional mediocrity that all franchises eventually generate if they run long enough. Both of those things were The Walking Dead. The golden age and the machine, the vision and the franchise. Days Gone By and the 22nd episode of the 11th season. All of it was the same show, in the strict technical sense that it carried the same title and featured many of the same characters and aired on the same network. And none of it was quite the same show, because each phase was produced under conditions so different from the others that the continuity of title and character was as much a convention as a reality. What the story of The Walking Dead finally describes, when you look at all of it together, is something that most great things describe when you look at them closely enough. The specific, unrepeatable quality of a first attempt made by people who do not yet know that what they're attempting is extraordinary. The specific electricity of a story being told by the person who needed to tell it, under conditions that demanded everything they had, because nothing less would be enough. That quality existed in The Walking Dead. It existed fully in the first season and in various degrees across the seasons that followed. It was built by a filmmaker who had spent 4 years being told the story was not worth making. It was inhabited by an actor who gave the best years of his professional life to a character that he carried with complete honesty across nearly a decade. It was sustained by writers and directors and production designers and special effects artists who understood what the show was trying to be and tried, within the constraints of what the machine eventually required of them, to keep being it. The golden age ended. The machine ran on. As the ending was good, the beginning was great. And the distance between those two things, the distance that this whole story has been about, is not finally a story of failure. It is a story about what greatness costs, about the fact that the conditions that produce it are always temporary, about the specific and irreplaceable quality of work made by people who are still in the process of discovering what they are capable of, under conditions that demand they find out quickly, because the opportunity is present right now and may not be present again. The Walking Dead found that quality once. It held it for long enough to change what people expected television could be. It lost it in the process of becoming what it became. And what it became was large enough and present in the culture long enough, and sustained by enough genuine talent and genuine commitment that the world where it had existed was different from the world where it had not. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything. The man on the horse in the empty city, the little girl with the teddy bear in the parking lot, the walkers pressing against the chained doors with their grey fingers reaching through the gap, the silence that contained everything the world had been before it ended, and everything it might still be, if the people who survived were willing to keep fighting for it. Those images belong to the Golden Age. and the golden age belongs to all of us who were there for it. And neither of those things, the images or the belonging, can be taken away by anything that came after. There is one last thing worth saying about what The Walking Dead meant, not as a franchise and not as a commercial property, but as the specific experience of watching it when it was at its best. There was a period, roughly between the middle of Season 3 and the end of Season 5, when watching The Walking Dead on a Sunday night felt like a shared ritual. Not in the superficial sense of trending topics or social media engagement, though both of those things were present and enormous, in the deeper sense of a story that a large number of people were experiencing together in real time. And that was asking all of them the same question and trusting them to sit with the difficulty of answering it. That feeling, the feeling of a story being told to you rather than at you, is the thing that makes television at its highest level into something more than entertainment. It is the thing that The Walking Dead had, and that the machine, for all its capability and scale and professional competence, could not manufacture once the conditions that had produced it were gone. It was real while it lasted, and it was worth all of it. Close your eyes. Let the world that is still out there, in those old episodes, in that first season, in that combination of a filmmaker's vision and an actor's commitment and a story that took the end of the world seriously. Let it be what it was. Extraordinary, unrepeatable, worth every year it lasted, worth every viewer it reached, worth the fight